I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. We're talking about the history of the Northwest trade gun and its survival across almost 3 centuries. So I've been diving into trade guns. I have a personal interest in muzzleloading, but then also like business history and how things got started. I love hearing about how tech companies got their start, and I found this really interesting intersection between my interest in business development and muzzleloading in the industry that was built around the trade gun. And it's this kind of a vehicle that I've used to dive into these early companies, at least early in North America companies, and then just followed some really interesting lines and changes driven by industry at the time and then the customer base as well that have shaped some companies that are still around today, which I thought was super neat. The basis of all of this is we're talking about a trade gun, and a trade gun is really any class of firearm made in Northern Europe beginning in the early 17th century. And these were guns specifically made for barter, some believe with the natives of North America, sub-Saharan Africa, and South America. And in my previous reading, I'd really only focused on North America because that's where I'm at. And I haven't dove too far into South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, but I'm really interested in the idea of comparing the trade guns that were made for these different continental regions. It's not something we're going into today, but I thought that was just a neat tidbit. By 1670, the trade gun had a reputation for being the cheapest, most dangerous to the user firearm available for purchase. And that's a quote from S.J. Gooding's book on the history of the Hudson Bay trade guns. For this episode, we're going through a little bit of the history of these arms and how they went from being these cheap, dangerous, horrible arms to some of the finest and in the modern sense, most notable guns made before the 20th century. When I had proposed a pitch for this idea, this was just, I had a simple idea of the Northwest trade gun, but after doing all of this research, I've found that there's a whole lot more to the Northwest trade gun than I thought. So this is going to meander a little bit. The trade gun's a fascinating story, and we're just really scratching the surface. So we're going to be focusing on the Northwest trade here in North America, starting around the 1670s and running to the 1870s, focusing on the United States and Canada. And that region kind of ebbs and flows with different wars and treaties, as we'll talk about. Our key players through all of this were the European empires, originally the Dutch, and then the French and the English. And then later on, we'd introduce some of the big trade companies that we're all familiar with, the Hudson Bay, the Northwest Trade Company, the American Fur Company. The customers are the kind of the third pillar to all of this. You have the Native Americans, and then you have the European colonists, all purchasing and using basically the same arms being imported from Europe. In the 1600s, the Dutch are kind of the first to begin importing arms. Based on my research here, the Dutch were kind of the hotbed for arms manufacturing at the time. Liege was dubbed the Birmingham of Belgium. And the French do the same when they start to come into North America with their fusils, fusies, or fuzzies, depending on who you talk to there. All of those terms roughly translate to gun. And you have terms like fusil de chasse, which translates to a hunting gun, and fusil de trait. I'm not French. I can't speak French, but that just translates to trade gun. In 1716, there's a note from the French about gifts to distribute that year to, quote, maintain peace with the Indians and prevent them from trading with the English. So already in the early 1700s, we're seeing a little bit of this commerce back and forth happening between these European countries here. And the French had marked 600 trade guns to trade with the Native Americans for that time. And we see similar motives and similar documentation among the Dutch and the English of the same time, of wanting to get to North America and want to trade to protect their own interests. I want to talk real quick about what a trade gun is and kind of this evolving definition as we kind of continue through the story. And as I was reading about this, trade gun is a lot more ambiguous than many of us today think. And one trade gun historian, I'm trying to pin it down, but there's several notes to this effect where somebody would call a specific museum, I'm still trying to track it down, and ask if they had any trade guns. And the historian would answer, well, what's a trade gun? As kind of a cheeky acknowledgement to the shifting definition of these guns through time, because what was a trade gun in the 1600s was related to the 17 and 1800s, but not really. So I'm kind of considering the trade gun the ship or the gun of Theseus, which is an old proverb after several hundred years of maintenance, is if each individual piece of the ship of Theseus was replaced one after the other, is it still the same ship? And I think that kind of aligns well with the trade gun and its history. Across the 2 centuries of predominant use for these guns, there are 2 characteristics that hold true through the entire time. The first is that being a smoothbore. So it was utilitarian. You could use shot for fowl or other small game, or you could use a ball for something like a deer or a buffalo or anything larger, where you wanted a larger projectile. And the second, constant, we'll say, is the simple design and limited decoration for them. There are some examples of there just being nuts where you would traditionally see an entire plate being used. You're just using as little metal as possible to hold everything together. Some examples that I found had scribed lines instead of inlaid or cast detail on different parts. The iconic side plate of kind of the serpentine or dragon motif for the side plate goes from being a simple flat cutout with some light engraving to being a fairly ornate cast piece over time. And a key thing that we see in the documentation from the trading posts back to the gunsmiths in Europe was a demand for the pieces to be field repairable and to have as much part interchangeability as possible. Now, that is kind of limited over the years because you have a lot of people that are on the frontier and kind of out in the middle, out in nowhere, no man's land kind of thing. But those are the 2 main constants: simple design and that smoothbore utilitarian nature. Looking at the iconic Northwest trade gun is kind of the thing that many of us see. I think it's probably the Type D, is what you could call it. But you have a flintlock ignition. You see earlier locks and you see later locks. You have a flat butt plate. It's sheet brass. It's commonly nailed on. So they weren't taking the time or spending the money to make screws and apply screws. They're just literally hammering these pieces together as quickly as possible. You have a large brass trigger guard. Sometimes these would be screwed on, but we have examples of them being nailed on as well. And I don't know if I mentioned that trigger guard could be sheet brass or it could be a cast brass. That large D-shaped trigger guard, a lot of people say is so you could fit a gloved or mittened hand in there and still operate your trigger when it was cold out. And commonly you see 3.5 to 4 foot smoothbore barrels. And, a lot of times in the American long rifle scene, we see longer barrels. In some of the New England fowling pieces and things, we see much longer barrels. But the trade guns kind of max out at around 4 feet. There are some examples of them being longer, but the large numbers that we see are usually between 3.5 and 4. The earliest note that I've been able to find about a Northwest trade gun is in 1674. The Hudson Bay Company describes a trade gun as a fowling piece or snap ounce with steel furniture, smoothbore, no rifling, and a dog lock, which is a large flintlock that has an external dog or catch that holds the hammer back as kind of a safety. And in the 1670s, we see generally them being large caliber, from about 50 to 78 caliber, depending on what was being ordered. These were all imported through Europe. As we get into the end of the 18th century and we head into the early 19th century, the War of 1812, that brings a lot of production stateside into North America because of the war. It just changes things. Again, going back to the trade and treaty and things, shifting what these guns are over time. Trade guns are often associated with native trade and use, and the Northwest trade gun, as far as I've seen, is not a term seen until the 18th century, but there's some conflict among historians on that, about when the Northwest term comes in there. The Northwest is interesting because we later have companies name themselves Northwest to associate with the Northwest fur trade. But the consensus is that the Northwest name being associated with the arms came before those companies made their names Northwest. So there's a little bit of brand conflict happening, which we'll get into. Jumping to, again, the traits of the gun here, the smoothbore was radically important to the customer base through the entirety of the trade gun's use. I have a quote here from Randolph Kurtz in the 1850s. So we're halfway through the 19th century, and the smoothbore is still important to the customer base. The quote says, "In the first place, on buffalo hunts, they do not carry rifles for the reason that they think the care required in loading them takes too much time unnecessarily when shooting at close range. And furthermore, they find rifle balls too small." So I just thought that was a neat quote, that we're into the West and we're well past what many think of the flintlock age, but we're still holding on to the smoothbores for these guns. So the Northwest trade gun would evolve over its lifespan. The names changed, dimensions changed, where they were made changed, components changed, purpose changed, but 99% of the time, these were smoothbores. Utility first, and it was a customer preference that helped it survive so long. We see trade in North America begin to scale in the we have the Eastern fur trade. Some say starting in the 1500s, but it really picks up in the mid to late 1600s. And the Eastern fur trade really goes and finishes just before the 1830s or so. And we're focusing on Eastern North America. Like I said, we have the Dutch, French, and the English. These trade companies begin to invest a little bit later on. Colonists and settlers arriving, increasing demand for these trade outposts. And this demand begins to affect and draw business and industry. This industry leads to then collaboration, and we begin to see some of the same things in business that we recognize today, like investors, companies, marks, and brand names. And really the first big player that we see is the Hudson Bay Company. It's formally founded in England in 1670. It still operates today in Canada, which is fascinating, but it just operates as kind of a retail clothing store, as far as I can tell. The original documentation says that the Hudson Bay Company began with the goal of finding the Northwest Passage and establishing trading posts around James and Hudson Bay. And the Hudson Bay Company is interesting because it was later become just a business juggernaut in North America, and in some cases, a de facto government body across the Northwest as English and French interests kind of shifted and moved around. The Hudson Bay Company wanted to be the first and largest trading company in North America. Their main goal was to buy as many furs as possible to sell to the Europeans for the fur trade there. The focus on this episode is the trade gun, of course, but the trade gun couldn't exist without the fur trade. And there's several documents between the different committees of the Hudson Bay Company here where they're basically laying out the plan and the reasoning for providing these guns. They want to provide a cheap, functional gun to make it easier for hunters to hunt for their family, to make it easier for hunters to feed their family, so that these hunters can spend more time trapping to trap furs to trade to the company. That is their roundabout process for this. They want more time for their hunters and traders to acquire furs for the company. And that is their modus operandus for building this industry. We see the first documented order of trade guns from the Hudson Bay Company in 1672. Earlier orders are expected, but we don't have any documentation about that. The first order is for what they quoted as 200 fowling pieces, including a proportional amount of shot and powder. The order could have been for the entire year or a single shipment. We don't really know what that quantity of 200, how long that was expected to last. Mr. Bailey gives his opinion according to an order formally made that for an additional cargo for the year, ensuring that there be supplied 200 fowling pieces and powder and shot proportional. And that's what the order is. That's Mr. Bailey requesting that. So in the 1670s, the earliest fowling pieces were made off of existing patterns from Europe because they knew they wanted a fowling piece, but this was this was new territory and a new customer base for them. So these early fowling pieces are expected to have been the same inexpensive arms sold to colonists or farmers and settlers in North America. But after use in the Northwest, the design shifted to a customized pattern, we're going to call it, although it's not necessarily a pattern as things change. And these new patterns began to focus on the needs of the customers in North America. There's a lot of focus here, again, on the requests from the Native American customer base as time passes. Gunsmith Samuel Oakes is credited as the gunsmith who designed the first Northwest trade gun in the year 1680, 8 years after the first order from the Hudson Bay Company for 200 fowling pieces was made. So it took that 8 years for them to have kind of a custom Hudson Bay trade gun that they would begin offering themselves. I have a quote here from an agent to the Hudson Bay Company in 1703. "Let the guns you send next not be altogether so big in the bore, for the Indians complain of the wildness thereof. Let the bore be of that size as to take a low East India shot, and let the grasp of the stock be somewhat smaller than the last, for the Indians complain of the clumsiness of them." That's in 1703. In 1740, we have another quote about the customization requests of these arms. "The guns are good, but have too much wood in their stocks, the Indians liking them more slender and to be free of knots, and also to have a guard larger, it being usual to draw the trigger with 2 fingers, which our guns will not admit of." I've always heard the mitten, tale that it was if you were hunting in the winter so you could operate still. I have an interesting quote later in the 1860s that we'll come back to with that it's going to show I think the importance of that 2 fingers again. In 1715, the Hudson Bay Company buys guns from English makers at an average of 20 shillings each. Some of the earliest trade guns were offered at 8 shillings a piece. Again, in that early period, these are cheap, they're horrible, they're dangerous to the user. For context, the British long land pattern in 1715 was bought by the British military for 22 shillings. So we're only 2 shillings less than the contract military arms for the period that had ordnance, requirements and quality, documentation to ensure that they worked for the military members. So we're beginning to see that shift already. We're not even to 1720. In 1824, the Hudson Bay Company orders more than 40,000 flints from Europe. They ordered 20,000 black flints and 20,000 superfine flints. And this is again from S.J. Gooding's book. In 1829, competition drives the cost of the guns from 18 beaver skins apiece to 3 beaver skins apiece. In 1831, the price normalizes in quotes there, up to 20 beaver skins. So again, we have that fluctuation through time with just one company and how competition and things change. And going into competition, as we enter the 1700s, we're in a new century and we have new competition. Train companies, governments are all vying for manufacturer time and resources because, again, these guns are being made by the same manufacturers that are producing arms for Europeans in Europe, as well as the government and trade companies. So even there are only so many manufacturers for Europe, North American colonists, and then these trade companies. They're all vying for that same resource. Demand for trade goods and working arms remains high. Tools are being used, broken, and replaced. All these items are consumable. This is really a gold rush of fur, and money continues to get shoveled into the Northwest Territories. In 1783, 100 years after the Hudson Bay Company operates in the Northwest, the Northwest Company forms in Montreal. The Northwest Company doesn't reinvent the wheel. They immediately begin ordering copies of the Hudson Bay guns with notes to improve on the Hudson Bay products, including the trade guns. So in the Northwest Trading Company's initial orders, they outline points of improvement that they want the gunsmiths to improve on. They want the lock finish to be better. They want the metal tempering to be better, so the durability of the function of the frizzen that the flint strikes to create the spark, they want that to be improved. They want the spring quality of the lock internals improved. They want the lock components in general to be improved, and they want the lock geometry to be improved because of, and this is documented for the time, which is really interesting, complaints about the pans losing powder, meaning I think that the spring on the pan is not strong enough to keep it closed all the time. And so people are moving around, and as their guns get moved, that pan is the frizzen is flopping up and down, and they're losing their priming charge. Almost everybody's been in that place where you're pulling up to take a shot and it doesn't go off. And imagine having that and looking and seeing that the powder's just gone. It totally negates the function of the arm. So the Northwest Company begins to play off of the Hudson Bay Company's strong brand identity for the time. The Northwest Company begins to order the same marks from the Hudson Bay Company be applied to their arms because the customers at the time were seeking out the Hudson Bay marks as a mark of quality because the Hudson Bay Company kind of led them from the 8-shilling guns to the quality of the 20-shilling guns. So they're looking for those marks to denote that quality. In 1799, the Northwest Company orders 30 Northwest guns, quote, stamped the same as Hudson Bay. In 1800, we see another order of 160 Northwest guns, quote, stamped exactly the same as the Hudson Bay. This leads to its entire own massive counterfeiting industry, which is just a rabbit trail that we're going to have to go through another time because it gets into the government level and the British and the French governments, which is it's just wild. Ryan Gale's book for Trade and Treaty goes through and documents a ton of those marks and their similarities, and it's something that we're going to talk about for sure. So in 1820, the Northwest Company places an order for 720 Northwest guns, again, stamped the same as the Hudson Bay. So this is kind of the peak, really, for the Northwest Company, and we're not sure how long it took to sell these individual orders, but you can see that change in order quantity over those 43 years, give or take. In 1821, just 1 year after that peak order that we see from the Northwest Company, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company would merge into one company. The Northwest Company's aggressive business strategy here in copying and duplication in the Northwest guns, which we can only assume that if they're willing to do that with the Northwest guns, what other trade goods from the Hudson Bay Company were they doing that as well? So I haven't dove into enough of the back and forth on that to see what instigated it, but I think it's fair to say that the Northwest Company took enough of a chunk from the Hudson Bay that they considered this acquisition or merger. So during the same time that the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company are going back and forth, the French and British governments are contracting similar numbers of trade guns for their own purposes. The British placed an 1813 order during the War of 1812 for 5,230 common guns, 5,460 chief's guns, 1,000 pistols, 225 gun locks, and 67 gross worms. And those worms aren't like night crawlers or anything. They're not looking for just the grossest worms they can find. Those are just a tool for the muzzleloader to wind toe around to run and clean. It's a maintenance item, really, for these muzzleloaders. So that's the interesting part. I'll have some notes on it later, but in conjunction with these guns, there's an entire manufacturing and trade business just to support these guns in the field. You have the powder and the shot and horns and all the other supplies that go with these, the maintenance tools and things that go along with this that have to be manufactured as well. So there's just a huge industry supporting each of these trade outposts. So as we get into the late 18th century and begin to get into the early 19th century, demand and geopolitical forces begin to make much more of a shift on the Northwest trade gun than I think the trade companies on their own could do. post the American War for Independence, we have arms production increasing in the United States. We have national pride kind of becoming a bit of a thing, but we're still part of a global economy. So the cheaper arms for the period are still being manufactured in Europe and imported. And there's hundreds of years at this point, really, of brand loyalty at play. So if you're looking to purchase a gun, and your dad and your grandfather all got their start in the new world here with a Hudson Bay gun, you have a little bit of depending on when you got that gun, really, what quality it was, you might have a loyalty to that brand over some of the other brands that are out there. And then the War of 1812 really begins to impact, again, how all of the trade gun functions. Post-American War for Independence, the fur trade is still going strong, and the demand for civilian and trade arms is still there. From 1806 to 1815, there's an embargo on British import goods in the United States, which is huge because, again, these cheaper arms, England is a powerhouse for exporting these cheaper arms. They've got it figured out over several hundred years now. The trade companies at this time with this embargo don't have access to some of their top products. This is where we really enter the American Fur Company, which started in 1808. The American Fur Company takes action fairly quickly and turns focus for their arms or their trade gun manufacturing to American builders to continue a supply of trade guns in the United States. With this, they begin to offer new patterns. Again, the ship of Theseus here. We have Americanized patterns of trade guns that take inspiration from a lot of the iconic American long rifles that we see from just before this period and start applying it to cheaper, more mass-produced arms, and we diverge from the Northwest trade gun. But even with this change in focus and styling, the American Fur Company still has to provide a traditionally patterned Northwest trade gun 120 years after the Northwest trade gun had really gotten its start in North America. The American Fur Company places an order in 1828 for 260 Northwest trade guns. In 1830, they order 150 English Northwest trade guns with 3-foot 6-inch barrels. They order 30 Liege Northwest guns with 4-foot barrels, and then just 30 Northwest guns with 4-foot barrels. In 1831, we're getting into the percussion era here. They still order 90 just plain Northwest guns. This is going to be from Ryan Gales for Trade and Treaty. In the late 1830s and early 40s, smooth rifles, smoothbore barrels with the appearance of rifles became popular with American hunters and sportsmen, which were made by gun makers such as James Henry and Henry Lehman. Yet, when asked to make the transition from smoothbore shotguns to smooth rifles, the American Fur Company refused. They had their finger on the pulse of what their customers wanted, and even though the arms manufacturers wanted this, they wanted to make this change, the American Fur Company said, no, we've got to stick with what people want. At the same time, Pierre Choteau Jr., French pronunciation here, we're just going to refer to him as Pierre moving forward. He starts being an agent for the American Fur Company and begin kind of operating on his own around the same period. He begins and operates in St. Louis primarily and becomes the gateway to the West as we leave the Eastern fur trade here. He becomes kind of the Western agent for the American Fur Company and does business with them privately until 1842 when the American Fur Company ultimately folds. And that's really, I think, we're seeing the end of the Eastern fur trade as these companies begin to collapse or change their business just dynamically. The West is a whole different animal, and these companies are just unable to make that change. Pierre, though, continues to be the dominant trader in St. Louis at the gateway to the West until 1859, and he does this on his own after the American Fur Company folds. So he's just got a business knack, and he's able to carry this. So we're in a new region and a new country, a new company, but we're still ordering similar trade guns as the American Fur Company and the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company all before. Pierre runs the fur trade business model until its end, well past all of the giants. In 1851, he orders 590 Northwest trade guns. Now, we don't have a designation here as to what these guns were or looked like, if they were flintlock or percussion, but he's still ordering 590, which, based on our previous orders we've talked about, is a significant number of these guns to be ordering in the 1850s. We have tons of other developments just right around the corner, and he's still buying and selling over 500 of these. Pierre would go on to sell other models of guns. So where the American Fur Company refused, Pierre picks that up and begins to offer a wider variety of guns for the period. And he picks up more guns from those makers we named before, Henry and Lehman. He picks up specifically updated American and English pattern arms, rifles being a key attribute. That's one of the main things that he begins to offer that none of the other companies wanted to at the time. What's interesting here is that Lehman would go on to produce Northwest trade guns until 1860. And Lehman offered some of his own pattern of like Lehman trade guns and things. It kind of became its own house brand, really, of these guns, similar to the Northwest gun, but it just didn't last as long. So it wasn't nearly as iconic. While the trade companies are doing what they're doing, operating and running these massive businesses for the time, the governments of Europe are running very similar alongside them, running materials and supplies and arms and guns into North America to protect and secure their own interests. And this is really where we get into the concept of the gift gun for the period. England and France would use what they would call gift guns to influence Native Americans. England would begin the Board of Trade as a means to manage what they called, quote, Indian expenses. In 1755, England tries to offload surplus military arms to the quote native trade, but it doesn't go over well, and all of their agents in North America send the guns back with rather scathing letters about the quality of them and how the customers at the other end, and the Native Americans here predominantly, really did not like these guns, and they would not take kindly to another shipment of them. And that if England wanted to keep favor in the region where they had sent these, that they would not send another shipment of guns like those, which I thought was interesting. Again, the customers are wanting very specific models, and they're not accepting changes. British guns would end up being stamped with a Circle Fox touch mark, which is an interesting crossover and a little bit of a tease again to the counterfeiting that we talked about, because this Circle Fox mark is very similar to some of the Hudson Bay marks that we see at the same time. So I don't know if it's a duplication or if it's a mark from that Board of Trade denoting these as a specific route. They want these specifically for the native trade. It's something I want to dive into a little more. Post-American Revolutionary War, England really begins to focus on Canada, exchanging guns for land in Canada. The gifts focused on hunting rather than military use that we saw pre and during the American War for Independence. And this is where we begin to see the term and the documentation and the designation between a common or a chief's grade gun as a descriptor of quality. Again, we hit the War of 1812, and that gift focus on hunting shifts back to what we saw during like the French and Indian War or the American Revolutionary War, and this movement of arms into the region is more militarily focused. And the Board of Ordnance at this time proposes an order of 26,000 muzzleloaders to arm Native Americans to fight for British interests in the regions. So massive numbers again. Another timeline here in 1795, kind of along with the gift gun concept here, the U.S. government builds and operates trading posts in the West to, quote, supply necessities and promote peace. In 1806, the U.S. establishes the Indian Trade Office, it's a quote. And in 1824, the Department of the Interior creates the, quote, Office of Indian Affairs. So this is, again, right alongside those British and French orders, basically at the same time period. From 1856 to 1860, the U.S. government purchases 7,500 Northwest trade guns from Lehman, with thousands more from other builders on the East Coast. So again, just huge numbers of these guns being ordered in a 4-year time span in the middle of the 19th century. Again, we don't have a designation on if these are flintlock or percussion, but there's a lot of documentation from the time about the requests specifically from the Native Americans and the other people buying these Northwest trade guns that they like and want flintlocks specifically. One of the other major builders of the time was Derringer. I mentioned other East Coast builders. He's known today for his pocket pistol design, but the native trade and military contracts with the U.S. government were actually the largest parts of his business. Derringer was asked to copy the English Northwest trade guns to supply Native American trade during the British trade embargo of 1812. In 1812, the government asked Derringer to build the, quote, best finished smooth gun he can afford at $8. Derringer would submit his first round to the government review board, and they would reject it for being too far superior, and that's a quote. And the government asks for a cheaper version in 1813, and the first order from Derringer of 100 Northwest trade guns is accepted by the U.S. government in 1815. That request for improved quality continues and then is tempered depending on who is purchasing them and who they are trying to sell the guns to. By the 19th century, the fur trade corporations are dwindling or shifting focus. Small shops like Pierre and St. Louis are still operating. To supplement this, the U.S. government begins to step in, providing arms or ordering arms where these private trade companies used to. Demand for the Northwest trade guns is still there, and tax dollars / government buying begin to push the trade gun further. So we've hit a bit of a lull in our trade gun stocks here, our stock ticker, and the government just influxes these orders, again, for that one order of like 7,000, and just throws it right back up, just flooding the market with these. In the 1820s and by the 1840s, really the percussion lock and cap become popular among sportsmen and hunters in the U.S. and Europe. In the 1860s, the Hudson Bay Company struggles to source flintlock guns. And this is a quote from the Hudson Bay Company committee to John Edward Barnett and Son, a gunsmith in England in 1861. Quote, "From the difficulty which you and other manufacturers have found in supplying flintlocks of quality formerly furnished, it has occurred to the governor and committee that it would be desirable to familiarize the Indians generally with the use of percussion guns, and the board have some idea of this year sending out a few, say 50 or 100, as a trial." So the gun makers in England are saying very kindly to the Hudson Bay Company, "We're having trouble making this work. Can you try what we're making now? Everybody here loves it. Can we try it?" I've got a picture here in my deck. We'll throw up in the show notes though, of a Hudson Bay trade gun, and this is dated 1863, and this is a Barnett flintlock Northwest trade gun. So that same maker that I just quoted there this is one of their flintlock guns produced in 1863. When you compare it side by side to some of the earlier guns, there are quite a few differences. The hammer specifically has undergone a lot of changes. This is a much later style, kind of reinforced hammer. The lock plate has changed. The butt stock has shifted quite a bit, but we still have our large D-ring or D-shaped trigger guard, again for that 2 fingers. We have a pretty flat butt plate. We have a short barrel. We have very limited hardware throughout this whole thing. Again, they're wanting to produce something of quality, but they're wanting to make it cheap and affordable. In 1864, Edward Bond writes to the Hudson Bay Company, quote, "We regret extremely the continued complaints about the flintlocks, but every year it becomes more difficult to get flintlocks, especially for the fine guns, as none are now made excepting for your company, percussion locks being now universally preferred. We will, however, do our very best to try and get satisfactory locks, and will give an additional price to try to get some made." This is 1864. 1865 is in many ways the final nail in the coffin for the flintlock in North America. The American Civil War leaves North America with thousands of surplus arms and surplus manufacturing capability for new-styled arms. These arms flood the Western trade routes, and many of these arms are breech-loading and are seen as, in all aspects, superior to both flintlock and percussion arms. In 1871, the treaties and trade agreements in the West, especially with the Native Americans, all stopped. The government stops orders and stops issuing trade permits. The reservation system has started and mass relocation continues. In 1872, the government allows distribution of muzzleloaders to the reservations to be used only to hunt and provide food. The government issues limited, quote, rifles, but all the notations, while they called them rifles, show that they were distributing smoothbores. The government was handing out limited powder, ball, and shot. It's all restricted, and the arms and supplies being distributed are no longer new. So there's a lot of notes and documentation here that they are distributing semi-functional, oftentimes not functional, surplus military arms, repaired arms, or just barely functioning trash, really. In 1887, Isaac Hollis supplies the last 8 flintlocks on record for the Hudson Bay Company. And I have a picture here on this slide, slide 49, of an Isaac Hollis and Sons percussion Northwest trade gun. So it's, in many respects, very similar to the early Isaac or the Barnett trade gun that we looked at in the stock design and the other attributes, but we see a percussion lock here. So in closing, just to recap here, how did the Northwest trade gun survive this long? And part of that survival is attributed to an ambiguous definition. It's a Northwest trade gun, it's ordered as a Northwest trade gun, but it didn't stay exactly the same that whole time. The Northwest trade gun shifted to adapt to the times while keeping to the core customer requests. It was an affordable, utilitarian, large caliber smoothbore working arm. It survived thanks to public and private partnerships. The trade companies, gunsmiths, and government officials all worked to fill a need of the customer base while it was advantageous to them. So they weren't doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, as we've seen and as history shows. But there was a request by customers, and all of these people worked to fulfill that and keep the trade gun going. And the third aspect really is customer loyalty. Trappers and traders of a variety of backgrounds, notably Native American, did not accept anything other than a Northwest trade gun for generations. Much like we talk about business ecosystems today, the same existed in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century with these trade goods. Like I touched on earlier, the Hudson Bay Company wasn't just selling the Hudson Bay trade gun. With it, you could get a Hudson Bay Company powder horn, Hudson Bay Company coffee, a Hudson Bay Company axe, and a Hudson Bay Company blanket and everything. So like you have an iPhone and a Mac and AirPods, you had Hudson Bay Company of all that stuff too. In closing, I learned a lot researching this. My idea of the trade gun changed a lot while doing so. I had kind of penciled together what I thought this was going to be, and it really changed. I went in thinking this was kind of cut and dry history of a long-standing working arm, but it wasn't. The history of the Northwest trade gun is simultaneously crisp and blurry at the same time, and there are several really neat rabbit holes to go down relating to companies, makers, and traders. There's just a lot of neat stories here. I have some points of research that we'll include in the show notes for this. My first one here is the Museum of the Fur Trade in Nebraska. They've got a great website, and they've published several really great resources. I wanted to include their books. I just couldn't get them here in time. The next book that I used, or the first book really that kicked this off, was For Trade and Treaty by Gale. It's published by Track of the Wolf. The next book was Trade Guns of the Hudson Bay Company, 1670 to 1970 by Gooding. And then there's The Art of the English Trade Gun in North America by Bender. I have not had a chance to read it yet, but I'm really interested to see what it has to say about the transition of this styling and artwork. And if you're looking for a lot of photographs, it's pretty easy to find quite a few online. Most of the auction sites, though, I find have some of the better pictures that are freely available and accessible online. But most of them that I've seen have been later pieces. Ryan Gale's book for Trade and Treaty has a ton of fantastic full color pictures of all eras of trade guns that I encourage people to look at if they can pick that book up, because it's the first thing that I found that has a really comprehensive kind of modern photography level of all of this stuff. It's hard to compare modern photography to 80s or 90s photography, but that's a personal favorite of mine. And that's all I've got. That's the trade gun, at least my first little dive into it. I'm Ethan. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.